It's 20 below tonight. They're getting 10 inches of snow. I don't think there's going to be anybody left in Bemidji, actually. It's very different than Los Angeles, where I come from. Here, everybody is so sweet and so nice. I got my first real chance to interact with Minnesotans when I did a Tea Party event on the steps of the Capitol in Minneapolis. I think it was 3 years ago. And I was dressed exactly like this. And the air temperature was 21 degrees, and the wind chill at the top of the stairs was about 15 below. And people I'd never seen before in my life just came up to me and said, "Oh, you look cold, but you should get your coat. I got a coat in the car. Look at my car. It's only half an hour away. I'll go get my car. Look, there's a Sears. There's a Sears down at the bottom of the hill. We'll take you to Sears. We'll get you a scarf or some gloves. You look like you're freezing." Well, I said I'd rather look good than feel good. But they're very, very different people here than there are back where I come from. I love getting on a plane, leaving Los Angeles, and coming to visit the United States of America. People back in LA are not like this. They're mean-spirited, low-life dogs, and they'll shoot you for a dime. And I think the only reason you don't see so many dead people just on the streets of LA is because people just pick them up and put them in the front seat so they can drive in the carpool. It's not a good time. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me while I ruin my political career here. We're running out of money. We're out of money. We've got our concerts under attack. You know, the economy's about to crash due to this out-of-control debt. We've got all kinds of chicanery and voter theft and everything else that's going on. And the mainstream media wants to talk about a guy taking a sip out of a water bottle like it's a news story. It's just disgraceful. Again, before we get started, I did an event yesterday in Bemidji, and a guy from the Bemidji newspaper came up and wanted to ask me some questions afterwards. And we sat there and we talked for about a half an hour, and I talked about public schools and how I was not in favor of what they were doing in the Department of Education. And this conversation that we had with this reporter was he spent a half an hour trying to convince me that I was wrong. And he didn't succeed. But it wasn't until it was after it was over and I started walking away that I realized even in a small town newspaper, forget the mainstream newspaper, they're not here to interview me. They're not here to get a clarification of what I said. They're certainly not here to report what I said. They're here to argue with me. They're here to convince me that I'm wrong. This kind of bias is so built into it. I had the exact same experience in Toronto, where a reporter came out and the photographer, who's supposed to just take my picture, starts yelling at me about my support, or why I didn't support affirmative action. I have to spend a half an hour convincing their photographer. That's not reporting. That's not reporting. They're essayists, they're propagandists. And if we had an actual press in this country, we wouldn't have any of these problems. None of them. None. But anyway, let's get started. So, first of all, the fact that you're out here today means that you guys have a certain amount of courage and a certain amount of resilience. It must be bred into you from these winters, honestly, because after 4 years of Obama and then to lose that election the way we did is just knocks the living wind out of every single person that I know. Everybody that loves this country has just taken a serious beating over the last 4 years, and it didn't get worse than it did in November. That's as bad as I've felt ever, I think, as bad as I've felt ever. So the first thing I want to say is the fact that you're here today means that your love of your country and your love of everything that makes this country great is still alive in you, and that's what we're going to have to depend on, because the Democrats on upper levels in Washington and in New York and in Los Angeles are running something called Operation Demoralize. And it's not an official policy, but basically what they're trying to do is to feed into the media and into the press everywhere they can the idea that the conservatives are finished, the Republicans are finished, and especially the Tea Party's dead and over and gone. They want every single one of you to think that you're the last person alive who believes in these things. And they want to make sure that you feel as isolated and as downtrodden and as disheartened as possible. Because their final success is only predicated on one thing, and that's one thing only, and that's us giving up. If we give up, they're going to win, and if we don't give up, we're going to win. It's fun to be surrounded by so much snow, because when I'm surrounded by this kind of snow, I'm reminded of my favorite snow story of all time. And it happened back in Bastogne during World War II, just in the winter of 44 going into 45. It looked like we had the war pretty much iced, and the Germans just came out of nowhere with this massive armored offensive. They snuck, armored divisions came through the Ardennes, and just a surprise battle called the Battle of the Bulge. And in the winter of 44-45, there was a small group of Americans in a town called Bastogne. They were utterly surrounded, completely surrounded by the Germans. And these were mostly cooks and clerks. I mean, these weren't combat guys. And they just, the best armor that Adolf Hitler had just completely overwhelmed them and utterly surrounded them, but they didn't overrun Bastogne. They managed to hold out. And the commander of one of these units at Bastogne, a guy named Creighton Abrams, who the Abrams tank was named for, went out one morning and he looked around with his binoculars and he looked out on all the snowfields and he saw German positions everywhere he turned, everywhere on the compass point. They were utterly surrounded by the worst that Adolf Hitler had. And Creighton Abrams turned to his adjutant and said, "Well, they've got us completely surrounded, the poor bastards." That's really how we have to feel, you know. That's really how we have to feel. They've got us utterly surrounded. They've got us utterly outgunned. We're outnumbered 100 to 1. They've got all the equipment. They've got all the training. They've got all the tanks. They've got all this stuff. And here we are stuck in this snow, surrounded by the enemy, and we've got nothing but just guts to hang on for. And that's all you need, you know. That's really all you need. You just need the guts to hang on. So what I really want to spend most of the day talking to you about today is simply this. You need to have the guts to hang on because these people are going to lose. I know it seems hard to believe now, especially after this last election. I know when we're feeling the way we feel that it's hard to believe that they're going to lose, but they're going to lose. They're going to lose, and they're going to lose historically and epically. And they're going to lose for reasons more important than just the fact that we're opposing them politically. Forces are at work that are going to cause the destruction of everything they believe in, that are much bigger than politics. They're much bigger than country. They're much bigger even than history. Massive, massive, enormous forces are at work going to make sure that these people aren't going to survive. They're not going to win. Their political philosophy is going to die out with them. And I'm going to make that case for you right now. So it may be hard to believe, but it's absolutely true. So you have to stay with me for about 10 minutes of history here, because once we lay this foundation, everything else will get pretty clear. So it really is, I do pity them. I do. I pity those poor bastards. They've got us completely surrounded. Here's the case. I think, and many people who study megatrends think, a guy named, I think it was Alvin Toffler wrote a book called The Third Wave, and this is a profound insight. When you really get down to it, there's really only been 3 things that have happened in human history of any importance. There have been hundreds of countries and scores of empires and probably thousands of wars and diseases and all this other stuff, but really only 3 things of any importance have ever happened in human history. And the first thing that happened that mattered happened about 7,000 years ago. It was the invention of agriculture, because human beings prior to that had been hunters and gatherers. That meant that every single one of you in this audience, if you lived prior to the invention of agriculture, every single one of you had to go out and get the food that you would need today for yourself. Every single member of the human species had to go out every single day and just scrape together enough food just to feed themselves for a night or two. And it was a real hard scrapful existence. It was just hand to mouth forever. But once they invented the idea of planting crops, once they invented the idea that you could actually grow enough food so that you didn't have to move, that the land could support a certain number of people, then something really amazing happened. Because once you had agriculture, you had the division of labor, you had the beginning of cities. What that meant was a farmer, just like they always have been, these heroes, these quiet heroes, a farmer could go out and grow enough food for 100 people or 1,000 people. And that meant that the other people didn't have to spend their entire day growing or chasing down food. The invention of agriculture meant that we could have things like philosophy, we could have music, we could have religion, organized religion, we could have science, because there were people who could do things full time other than go out and find enough food for themselves. So the agricultural revolution happened about 7,000 years ago, happened in Iraq of all places, really right by Baghdad. Mesopotamia means between the rivers, between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, out there by Baghdad is where they invented agriculture, is where they invented civilization. And that's the first wave of human invention, the agricultural age. Now, our government, and everything that we love about our government, this whole idea of limited government, constitutional government, the Founding Fathers, the vision for America, was a vision based on an agricultural society. That agricultural view of the world is baked into the Constitution. Because if you really think about it, what our government, what our federal government is designed to do really is just basically 2 or 3 things, right? Protect us from the Indians, the British, and those warlike Canadians who could come down any second now to ravage the peaceful people of the South. So the government's job is really protect us from the Indians, the British, and the Canadians, and maybe pave a road so that I can get my stuff from my farm to the market. Make sure that everybody plays by the same rules and that nobody cheats on their contracts, and that's about it. That's really it. Enforce these basic laws of fair trade, make sure that no one's cheating, defend the country, and maybe do some internal improvements like a series of roads. But other than that, that's all there was. There was no second, not for an instant did they think about things like a Department of Energy or a Department of Education. They had not a clue. If you had mentioned to one of the founding fathers that there should be gun control legislation in the Constitution, they would have laughed you, well, they wouldn't have laughed you out of town, they would have tarred and feathered you and ridden you out on a rail. What do you mean they're going to take away our guns? There are wolves out there, man. There are wolves and British and Canadians, and we got to be prepared to defend ourselves. So this entire idea of a government that we like, a government that's small and leaves us alone, is basically a government of the philosophy of people like us. And our philosophy, really, if you really want to boil it down, really to its essence is, get off my lawn, you damn kids. Just get off my lawn. I know everybody thinks it sounds cranky, but that's really what it comes down to, right? Get off my lawn. Leave us alone. This is mine. I paid for it. Do the basic fundamental things, defend the country, and leave us alone. That is an agricultural, agrarian view of the world. And that's the government that we got, and that's the government that we love, but that's not the government that we have today. That's nothing like the government that we have today. Because between the time of our founding and the present day, something else happened. The second big invention in human history happened. And that was called the Industrial Revolution. Now this is a really important point to understand. Thad McCotter, the representative from Michigan, brilliant guy, got me started thinking along these lines. Because no one in the government said, hey, you know what? It's time for us to invent the steam engine. I'm tired of farming. We need to invent the steam engine and the internal combustion engine. No, they didn't. The government didn't do that. These inventions happened. And when the power of steam power and mechanical power and fuel, like burning wood or coal or gasoline, came into effect, then all of the world changed. But the economy changed first. And this is the important point I'm trying to make to you. The economy changed, and then the government changed to reflect the new economy. So what happens when you have an industrial revolution? What does it do to the economy first? Well, when you have an industrial society, not everybody's living out in the country on farms anymore. In order to have an industrial society, you need people living in cities. And people voluntarily move from farms in the country to live in the cities because jobs that work in factories may not have been as much fun as living on a farm, but they paid better. So when the country became industrialized, people moved from the country into the cities. And when they moved into the cities, you started to get city problems. When our country was founded, virtually everybody in the country lived on farms or out in the country. But as you got into the post-Civil War period, late 1800s, early 1900s, more and more Americans lived in cities, and the immigrants that came over in the great wave of immigration turned to the last century were immigrants who didn't really know how to do anything, but a factory job was a pretty easy thing to do. You could figure out how to turn a wrench or pull a lever or whatever. And so everybody started to live in cities. That happened first. What happened after? Well, the government had to change in order to reflect a new society that was more urban. So all of the amendments that we got at the turn of that last century were all of these progressive amendments, the kind of stuff that we hate, right? The income tax was a result of this kind of thing. And things like prohibition. Oh, where everybody's drunk and everybody, you know, who works at the mill gets off the mill and they all go out and get drunk together, and we can't have that, so we're going to take away people's rights. And all of these progressive amendments, the 16th, 17th, 18th Amendment, these are catastrophes for American freedom. But all of this progressivism started in the late 1800s and the early 1900s as a way to address urban problems. Everybody with me so far? Yeah. Okay, that's the bad news. The bad news is, as the economy became industrialized, the government became industrialized too. An industrialized society is very centralized. It's very vertical. It's very fossilized. It's very power hungry. It's very unionized. All of these things are a result of an industrial economy. And so, over the course of the last 100 years, what was once an agrarian government became an industrialized government because it had to follow the economy. It had to. It had no choice. You couldn't have an agrarian government governing an industrial society. So, Washington became like the industrial era. Now, I grew up as a kid in the heart of the industrial era. Something's happened since then, and that's the good news that I'm going to get to in a second. But some of you are old enough to remember this. When I was a boy, in an industrial era society, as a boy, there were 3 TV networks. 3. You had ABC, CBS, and NBC, and that's all. The only reason people watch Hee-Haw on Sunday nights is because there's nothing else on the other 2 channels. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a Hee-Haw. But there were 3 channels. There were 3 car companies. You wanted to buy a car when I was a kid. I was born in '59, grew up in the '60s. You wanted to buy a car in America, You had a choice. You could buy a Ford, you could buy a Chevy, or you could buy a Chrysler. 3 TV networks, 3 car companies, 1 phone company, centralized, vertical, rigid, slow, powerful, very, very powerful, because everything's centralized in an industrial era economy. And that's what Washington has become. Washington has become this centralized, vertical, fossilized, rigid, big, dumb, stupid, slow, monolithic, horrible, giant tumor that sits there and tells all of us what to do. Because an industrial economy is a command economy. This factory will produce this, all this stuff is very, very, very centralized and localized. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. Excuse me one second. This is for you, Margaret. The third thing that's happened in human history has happened since the progressive era. We have a progressive government filled with socialists because they think and they talk about, I'm progressive. Progressivism goes back to at least 150 BC. There's nothing new about this progressive socialist idea. The idea of having the people, the royalty, distributing things, basically taking everything from the subjects and then handing them back a few peanuts, right? That idea is as ancient as humanity. There's nothing progressive about progressivism. These people say we're progressives, man. No, you're not progressives. You are the exact same thing as barons and dukes and earls and emirs and sultans and emperors and all this. This is ancient stuff that you've tried. You've tried it for 2,000 to 3,000 years. It's never worked once. There's nothing progressive about progressivism. The only new idea in human history is the idea of individual freedom and limited government. It's the only new idea anyone's ever had. So they tell you how progressive we are, but we're progressives. Nonsense. You're regressives. And they are running a society that is centralized and vertical and fossilized and big and stupid and slow. And they're bragging about it like it's some brand new thing. No. Because what's happened is the third big thing has happened in human history since the progressives came to power. The first revolution, the agricultural revolution, happened 7,000 years ago. The second revolution, the Industrial Revolution, started about 400 years ago. And the third revolution, the Information Age, started about 40 years ago. They get faster and faster. 7,000 years, 400 years, 40 years. But we no longer live in an industrial era society. We now live in a mixed economy, which is somewhat industrial era, but mostly and every day becoming more and more information age era. What does the information economy mean? What does that mean we live in an information age economy? Well, in an industrial era economy, the kind of thing that Washington is designed to govern, if I want to start a steel company, I've got to have $500 million, and I have to go to Pittsburgh, and I have to put in a factory, and I have to do all these other things in order to get the steel. I have to do all this stuff. But in the information age, I can just reach into my pocket here, and I can pull out my iPhone, and as I sit here right now, if I wanted to, if I was going to be rude for a minute or two, I could order steel from China right now. I could sit on the stool on a Sunday afternoon and have steel sent to any address in the world from China or from wherever else I wanted it made, and the stuff would just show up. Well now, that's a different world, isn't it? How is this big, fat, bloated, stupid, unionized, fossilized monstrosity of a state going to control people that can start businesses on a stool on a Sunday afternoon in Rochester, Minnesota? How are they going to control those people? They can't. They can't do it. They're going to lose. They have no choice but to lose. The government doesn't dictate the economy. The economy dictates the government. And when you think about what this new information era economy looks like, it looks nothing like the industrial era economy. And the Washington, or the government that's going to come, that is coming now, is going to look nothing like these guys. The new government is going to look like the new economy. And the new economy looks like this. It's dispersed, it's not centralized. It's democratic, it's not controlled from afar. When I say democratic, I mean the good D, the small D, not the big D, not the evil D. It's networked, which means that everybody's connected to everybody else, but it doesn't mean that the stuff comes down from the top. It means that all of these relationships are peer-to-peer relationships. You don't have to go to Washington or to Minneapolis to get permission. You talk to somebody else on the network. You go directly to them. You utterly bypass all of these lines of authority and spending and control. This is not a hypothesis on my part, and it's not, gee, it'd be nice. This is happening. It's happening right now. And every single day that goes by, we become more and more information age and less industrial age, and more and more, the society becomes the kind of society that these people in Washington hate because they can't control it. It's here. It's not like it's coming, it's here. And when you talk to 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 28-year-olds, all that cohort that voted for Obama, they think they're doing the progressive thing, and they think they're doing the thing that the cool kids are doing. But when you talk to 15, 16-year-olds, like I often do, or 14-year-olds, and you talk to them about something like a menu-driven government, they instantly get it. I don't have to explain it. I say, what would you think about a menu-driven government? They think that's cool. What is a menu-driven government? Well, a menu-driven government is if you imagine the smallest thing that the federal government is, let's say it paves the roads and defends the country. And let's say that on your income taxes in the coming future, which is going to be here, you decide, well, I have to pay 17% of my income, but I want to spend 16% of it. I like the National Endowment for the Arts, so I'll put 12% here, and I like defense, I'll put 4% here, and I like this, I'll pull this down, but I don't want to pay for this, and so on. And it's just a menu-driven government. People get this instantly. They get it instantly. So the world is changing. And the world is changing. And the good news for all of us here is that the world is coming, and the government that has to come is a lot friendlier to our values than the one that is being left behind, right? Because this new world is a dispersed world. It's a world where you make your own decisions. It's a world where Washington doesn't control anything. It's a completely non-unionized world. There are no unions for graphic designers. There's no unions for website developers. There's no unions for video game programmers or modelers or shaders. None of that. They just don't exist because people understand that in this new kind of economy, they have to think about themselves differently. And I'm going to finish making the case here because then I'm going to talk about the opportunities that this gives for all of us. But just as I talked about how the government is going to change and the economy has changed, the way we think about ourselves as workers, as citizens, changes. I'll give you a great example. In an industrial era economy, I might go up to a guy and say, hey, what do you do? And he'll say, I work for Verizon. That's a great industrial era answer. What do you do? I work for this giant company. But the way to think about this in the future is I walk up to that same guy and say, what do you do? I work for Verizon. Okay, you work for Verizon, but what do you do for Verizon? Oh, well, I'm an electrical engineer. Really? What do you specialize in? I specialize with radio frequencies. Okay, so you're an electrical engineer. Yep. Do you do anything else? What do you mean? Do you have any hobbies? I carve duck decoys. Okay. Are they any good? I think they're pretty good. Okay, so you're an electrical engineer with a specialty in radio frequencies, and you carve duck decoys. Anything else? You ever do anything else for a living before you became an engineer? Well, I drove a truck when I was in college, make some money. You have your commercial driver's license? Yeah. So you're an electrical engineer, you carve duck decoys, and you got a commercial driver's license. Anything else? I spent a summer on a farm when I was a kid and learned how to use a mechanical milking machine on a dairy farm. Okay, so you can run a mechanical milking machine, you're a truck driver, you carve duck